Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal, Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores, Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos.
Com o apoio do Instituto Cultural Vale, a arte popular é destaque no Maranhão.
E o nosso papel é fazer com que elas sejam conhecidas, valorizadas.
Vale, transformar a mineração hoje é transformar o amanhã de todos.
Eu estudava no Colégio Sembra, né, me formei lá, colégio público estadual aqui de Paraty, e o meu primeiro contato com a Flip foi através da Flipzona, né? O pessoal ia na escola, apresentava e entregava a ficha de inscrição. E quem tivesse interesse, então eu e os meus colegas, a gente falou assim, vamos fazer, né? Aí a gente foi fazer a oficina, eu tinha 14 anos, e é uma oficina que eu gostei muito, que era a oficina de reportagem. Vinha o pessoal da Folha de São Paulo para orientar a gente a como escrever texto, redação. E a gente saía com um caderninho, com caneta na mão, assim. Aí tinha as câmeras profissionais que a gente aprendeu a mexer para poder fazer foto, para fazer filmagem. E a gente se sentia o repórter, né? E a gente tinha acesso a vários escritores, diversas mesas. A gente tinha ingresso para poder entrar, para assistir as mesas, para poder entrevistar esses autores, né? Um deles foi o Caco Barcelos e o Misha Glenn, que eu fiquei na Flip, né, dos meus 14 até os meus 18 anos. E logo em seguida que eu me formei no ensino médio, eu tive a oportunidade de fazer o pré-ENEM social, que era ofertado pela Casa Azul, em parceria com a Flip. E lá eu tive toda a minha base para poder prestar o ENEM. E eu fui muito bem na redação, né? Eu creio que isso veio da Flip também, através da oficina da Flipzona, em produção textual, redação, saber redigir um bom texto. E aí, entrando no mundo acadêmico, você vê que o quanto a Flip ela é eficaz na vida de uma pessoa. Porque eu entrei dentro da universidade pública, na minha primeira aula de sociologia, a gente estava debatendo, né, o tema de criminalidade, e aí foram abordados os livros. E um dos livros foi O Dono do Morro, do Misha Glenn. E aí eu falei assim, já ouvi esse autor. Não só ouvi falar, como já estive com ele. E a Flip me permitiu ter esse acesso, porque ele deu uma palestra, né, quando ele lançou O Dono do Morro, e o Caco Barcelos lançou O Abusado aqui na Flip. E eu tive acesso a essa mesa, tive acesso ao Misha Glenn, e a gente acabou entrevistando o Caco Barcelos, né? Por questão de falar inglês, tradução, essas coisas e tal. A gente fez uma matéria com o Caco Barcelos. Então, assim, a Flip, ela não só me abriu os caminhos para entrar na universidade pública, mas também ela me agregou nas matérias da universidade pública, principalmente na área de direito, sociologia, filosofia do direito e criminologia, principalmente, que é um debate super importante para se debater no meio acadêmico, né? E, assim, ver aonde eu cheguei conseguir entrar numa universidade pública através da transformação da educação, através da Flip, isso é muito grandioso, é algo extraordinário. Porque eu sou nascida e criada aqui em Paraty, uma cidade com poucos recursos, sou de uma família muito humilde, uma família muito pobre, como eu disse, minha mãe é faxineira, sou neta e bisneta de pescadores artesanais, né? Fui criada pelo meu avô, minha avó só tem até a 3ª série do ensino fundamental, minha mãe só tem o ensino fundamental completo. É uma transformação de vida e é uma história que tem que ser contada para inspirar outras pessoas que pensam que não podem chegar aonde eu cheguei.
Flip 20 anos. Vidas que transformam lugares, que transformam pessoas. Escreva conosco essa história. Faça parte da rede amiga da Flip para continuarmos transformando juntos os próximos 20 anos. Acesse flip.org.br e faça sua doação. Ministério do Turismo, Instituto Cultural Vale e Associação Casa Azul apresentam 20ª Flip Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. O projeto conta com benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura. Vale Mais Cultura. Tem patrocínio oficial do Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Itaú. Copatrocínio O Globo. Apoio Esquilo, Mac Móveis, Prefeitura de Paraty, Globo Livros, Unigel, CQSFV Advogados e Oceana. Concepção Associação Casa Azul. E realização Secretaria Especial da Cultura, Ministério do Turismo, Pátria Amada Brasil, Governo Federal.
My wish to a young poet from the state of Maranhão when he was thrilled and plucked the string of yearning, God send the poet with a lute and said, sing, love, of loneliness, listen to the voice of the heavens. And he listened, sing a song of infinite love. Sing the extremes of a dear mother who adores you, who loves you so. Sing to the tender and gentle brothers and sisters of the celestial song, and to the old Father who gave you such love, raised you. Offer him your lute and the freedom. Sing, the poet. What would be the world continuing in darkness without freedom? Letters would have no life. It would be a pity. The ground would have no grass. Take freedom and glory in your name one day. Your name one day will live in history. Sing, poet, with your lute, tender sighs of your weeping lover. Sing to your cradle of the endless yearning, the memory of those far away. Tune the strings, give them your songs, strumming, sing to the exile, like David recalling yearning, although daring to mix love and weeping in cruel loneliness. Sing, poet, your song must be beautiful and liberating. In your arpeggios, sing the grandeur and closed and cloistered in God, to the moon and our stars escaping into the skies. Sing to the herdsman of the splendorous light. Sing, poet, your simple song, tender, serene, with the smile of angels. Sing to nature, to spring, to the flowers. Sing, woman, to the archangels. May God send to the desolate earth the balm, the saintly balm and holy balm. Sing, poet, to the freedom. Sing. What would the world be without such a finely tuned song? An angel came to earth, sweeping away the darkness. Freedom and glory. Take as your tone, and you will live in history. I don't order you to do so. I ask you to do so. I beseech you. It is not to want, it is to desire. My wish, my desire, my wish. Nothing more. I desire. And what else can I want? Camões, Dante, or Milton. Take this, poet, and die, by Maria Firmina dos Reis. Good morning. Welcome. Welcome, one and all. I'm Melina Brito, and I am part of the curatorship of Flip 2022, and here I am to launch our special roundtable, special for all of us, thinking of the things that you're going to experience now. Going directly to the subject, the decision to include or exclude what defines the literary canon of anywhere, under any circumstances, at any moment. Today's roundtable is called My Freedom, and it was conceived for us to think a little bit about the conditions and the tensions through the work of Maria Firmina dos Reis and this cultural project which we call Brazil, and it tried to relate this to our future. And the person who's going to lead this is Almeida Leal Cunha, a visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She is part of a laboratory on Black Studies and the Advanced Program on Contemporary Cultures. She's a full professor at the Federal University of Bahia. And since the 1990s, she researches and writes about violence permeating racial relations in Brazil. Fine. That's a mouthful. You can help us to lead this debate with your questions if you find our supporters waiting for you. Pick up your questions on the slips of paper. There's a book signing session all just across the road, and now I'll turn it over to Professor Maria Eneida. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. It's a huge pleasure. It's a huge challenge as well, as a university professor, living in one's bubble, to speak to so many people, to so many ears, eyes and ears, anxiously waiting for the panel. I want to begin by sending an embrace with solidarity to Professor Eduardo Duarte, who is part of this roundtable. He was supposed to be here, and he had other commitments in Belo Horizonte. Standing in for him, we have Perchance. Perchance is the name that we give to the forces that we cannot identify properly. So perchance, chance has brought us Professor Luciana Diogo, who is with us here as part of this roundtable. Luciana Diogo is a sociologist and a professor, researcher, and with a master's from the IEB and the University of Bahia, or the University of São Paulo, rather. Luciana has dedicated her work, the proper word is dedicated. She's dedicated her work to Maria Firmina dos Reis since 2011, when she was run over by the 4 volumes of the collection Literature and African Descendants of Brazil. She's going to be talking about this episode later, but this is a spoiler because this is a way of paying tribute to Eduardo for having organized this anthology. Luciana is editor of Firmina's, this journal, Aesthetics and Writing, focused on artistic production and intellectual production of Black women. She's the coordinator and editor of online content of the Maria Firmina dos Reis Memorial, publicizing material on this author, Maria Firmina. On the 26th, Luciana is going to be launching here at Flip, Maria Firmina dos Reis Literary Life. And you're all invited, of course, to that wonderful event on Saturday, the 26th of November. Sitting next to us also is our well-known and familiar character for many flips, the historian, anthropologist, professor at the University of São Paulo and the universities abroad, curator of several different editions, Professor Lilia Schwarcz. Lilia is a leader in a history of our universities and has been since the 1990s. She studies and publishes on the history of Brazil with a focus on ethnic and racial relations and tensions, and she taught many of us of these books that she wrote and coordinated, organized. I'm going to highlight just the ones that are closest to this roundtable. The Spectacle of Races from 1993, Racism in Brazil, Lima Barreto, the Sad Visionary, the History of Slavery and Liberty, the Black Encyclopedia, the African Brazilian biographies, and the most recent ones, the sequestering of the independence, the myth of September 7th, and we're going to be talking at the end about dark glasses, to see without seeing, or to look without seeing. This is a roundtable dedicated to Maria Firmina dos Reis, but it's a roundtable on freedom. It is a tribute not only to all the controversial freedom in Brazil, but especially freedom and the daring of a woman from the 19th century when everyone was against her. Everyone and everything was against her, with an extraordinary life story, a public experience. She taught, wrote, and she lived in her time, and she left a legacy and a memory which is not accessible until recently, very recently here, because of the silence imposed on Maria Firmina. I remember a quote, 2 quotes to be precise. This is a craft of a Professor Renan, the philosopher from the 19th century, in a conference. The title was, "What is a Nation?" This is the philosopher Renan. He said, oblivion, the same historical error, and the creation history is essential for a nation. The essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, but also that they have forgotten so many things. And he adds, to what interests us most directly is historical research and investigation brings to light the facts of violence that have occurred at the root of all national formations. Against this oblivion, we are here in this round table with a historian and a specialist in Maria Firmina dos Reis. I wish, and I would like, to begin, I'd like to turn the floor over for introductory words for her to take a position concerning the topic at hand.
Leva para Helene. I would like to thank you for the opportunity of being here, and I would like to wish Eduardo to recover from COVID, and I would like to ask all of you also to be careful with your health, and we know that COVID is yet again among us. Three things are very interesting when I consider Maria Firmina dos Reis. And this is how I'd like to address this. How can we think about the present? Or how can we critically engage with the past? And how can we imagine time? I guess Maria Firmina dos Reis is an author who helps us to consider these three different lines. How can I think about the present? She was thinking about her present time. She was a woman who was living her present, engaged with all things that were happening around her, and from that point on, she consciently decided to create a dialogue with some of the authors of her time, with some of the topics that she would understand and perceive that might not have been treated with the appropriate complexity. And the topic was slavery. This was the most crucial topic of her times, enslavement. How can I critically engage with the past? I guess Maria Firmina does this when she writes Ingopeva. Ingopeva is a novel or maybe a short story in which she will revisit the myth of the origins of Brazilian society, of the meeting between the colonizers and the native peoples. And she says that the native peoples, how they were differentiated, and the whole idea of imagining time, the critical story she tells, which allows us to consider our time, our present time, 200 years later. And these are the lines that I find interesting to consider at this moment, at this time. Thank you, Luciana. Lillian? I am a researcher who studies racial issues. So first I would like to thank all of you today and say that, like me, this audience is mostly white, and what we should do, I know that Eneida's opinion as intellectuals, as thinkers, as citizens, men and women in this country, where the black population corresponds to 56.4% of the total population. In the United States, the black population is 13 to 16%. In Brazil, we don't have a minority, we have a majority that is underrepresented everywhere. So it depends on us, and this is the great contradiction of Brazilian society. And the great contradiction is the enslavement from the past, and also the difference it brought to our present, the naturalized language of the differences. So it depends on us to act as allies in this anti-racist task. Our files, as Luciana and Eneida have said, are filled with these issues. These are colonial files, colonial documents which, in a way that is very linked to our history, are deeply European-centered and male-centered. We're talking about a black intellectual woman with lesser resources, and still she had a project and she has become a protagonist. So the first thing I would like to call your attention to is the whole idea of having a voice and entitlement. But the topic of this roundtable is freedom. Brazil was the last one to do away with slavery and has received also half of all the enslaved people in the world. Without freedom, desires will be just a utopia, things that are difficult to achieve and even more difficult to maintain. However, Maria Firmina, in 1887, she wrote 88, a hymn to the freedom of enslaved people. You can see how she had this premonition of what happened in Brazil. And she did more than that. She wrote an essay in 1887 called The Slave, and she would revisit a central topic of our society, the topic of the milkmaid, the one that would bring the absence of a child. And these are the stories from our past and from our present. And we have to think about the bill to support housemaids was only passed a couple of years ago, and this federal congressman who did not accept this was Jair Bolsonaro. Thank you, Lillian. I started by talking about Renan, and one of the things we learned is that we have to be with and against. Renan was a French-European white male, and he would say that only history research can only correct the memory of a nation. And we know that not only historic research, but also imagination is absolutely necessary to correct the path of a nation's memory. We don't have that many files, archives, and documents, but we have to invent the path that we wish to have. And I would like to remind you of that, because I would like to suggest Luciana to do some. She has such an interesting work. She wrote a letter to the Professor Maria Firmina dos Reis. So it would be interesting if she could talk to us about this letter and what is the content of this letter. This letter I wrote by invitation of the Tenda de Livros. This is a book of feminist publications and publishing house, and focused in publications that exist before the market itself. And in this dialogue, I thought about writing this in the form of a letter to talk about the trajectory of Maria Firmina dos Reis as a professor. As a professor, Eneida has already said, my meeting, so to speak, with Maria Firmina dos Reis happens when I am invited by a friend from college to participate in the launch of literature and Afro-descendancy collection. This was prepared by Professor Eduardo de Assis Duarte and Professor Nazaré da Fonseca. So my first contact with Maria Firmina's work started there. At that time, I was also a professor. And it was this dialogue between being a professor in the 21st century and being a professor in the 19th century, a professor that was starting her career at a moment where there were no training possibilities for Maria Firmina dos Reis. And Maria Firmina dos Reis did not go to have a formal education. She went to classes in the state of Maranhão, maybe what we call the basic just teaching, but she wasn't able to do that because she was a woman, she was black, which was different from what other people lived, other men, and the people that were able to reach a different level of national recognition, which Maria Firmina did not have the opportunity to have while she was alive. So in this letter, I tried to convey some of the questions I have in terms of the condition of a professor, the condition in which we actually act as professors, the material resources actually, and what are the expectations that move us, that drive us forward to actually deal with these lack of resources. And so one thing I find quite interesting also in this letter is it helps us consider and think how much at that time Maria Firmina was teaching. 11 students in the first class she was teaching, then 14, and then 9. So a number that goes down, which is different from what happens today. Today we have classes. I was also a professor of sociology. I had the opportunity to have more than 1,000 students throughout 1 year. So these are the conditions and the resources we have, and we have to consider how much Maria Firmina dos Reis was important so that one black woman might be addressing an audience such as yourselves based on one's intellectuality. So Maria Firmina, as a creator of other women, the woman who opened the paths for other women, is something we have to consider, the basis of education today. And it is essential that Maria Firmina, once again, is able to occupy the space of basic learning, basic teaching, and to be among professors, students, teachers in schools and colleges. I guess we can continue, Lilian, and you could talk to us a little bit about the importance of the diaries, of the journals, of how we dialogue with the past, the importance of documents and research, but also considering imagination to create the past that we want. How do we go about creating the past? This flip created by our colleagues, we will have Saidi Hoffman. She works with the concept, which I find amazing, which is critical fabulation. So the historiography is a very interesting. She said, "Oh, you're a historian. You might have a wonderful memory." I said, "No, I'm not, because we remember a little bit in history, but we forget a lot, and history systematically forgets black population and the populations that are not part of the power network." So those who actually work, and we all work, the three of us work with this type of material, we're always dealing with these gaps, these parts of history that are actually erased. So how can this happen? The book I wrote with Fábio Gomes is called Black Encyclopedia. More than 500 inserts of, and the word we used, and one of the publishers complained was, until now, we do not know. We do not know. We do not know. Because sometimes we know when these people died, because these people died because of repression, but we don't know when they were born. So in our entries, this is what we have to write. We do not know. So it's the whole idea of critical creativity, so to speak. So how can we invent this? We can actually fill these gaps with other elements from different documents. And what are the things that we are actually seeing? Of course, enslaved people were victims. Lima Barreto's character in the authorized study so much, he died at 41, and he died because of racism, or he died of racism. But there are different populations that were not only enslaved. These were populations that had projects, that were protagonists in their own lives. And this is why I am bewildered by the project of the creativity of Maria Firmina. If we look into Ursula, the two characters that are secondary, but not that much, they are enslaved, and they have projects, they have protagonism. So this whole idea of protagonism is essential. Maria Firmina herself, in her letter, she says that in her writing, she talks about her critical space. If you allow me to read just an excerpt, I'm not sure if you were able to understand how the book Ursula starts. It's always interesting to think about how she writes. And she starts by saying in the prologue, this is your humble and significant, and will certainly meet with the cold indifference of some of the mocking scorn of others. Yet I bring it to light, blinded neither by the illusion of becoming famous nor by the pride. It's It is the pride of being an author. I know that this novel is worth little because it was written by a woman, a Brazilian woman, moreover, with a little education, without refinement and experience of illustrious men used to discussing, advising, and correcting others. This woman has had very little instruction, knows only her mother's tongue, and isn't well read. In some, her intellectual capacity is practically null. You can see how she introduces herself, where she puts herself with a critical approach, with the emotional approach. This is the counter discourse that we have to do if we truly wish to challenge our canons, our daily lives, our past. The past is present. Thank you, Lilia. You were reading, and I was thinking about this. It's an idea to understand how we compose the literary landscape. This is a prologue that has an amazing parallel with the prologue called Paternal Blessings. Hers is a maternal blessing, and she talks about the goodness of her mother. She projects this and talks about the frailties, the difficulties that are hers. These are just, the prologue, Father's Blessing, is in Sonhos d'Ouro, and it's after Maria Firmina dos Reis' prologue. So let us continue, and we could maybe talk about ask Luciana how this protagonism was built. How can Maria Firmina actually build this protagonism? Because we have this whole idea that a protagonism has to do not only with a romance, a novel, and something that deals with the main couple in the book, even though she maintains a timeline of a white couple, emotional conflict, and of course within the structures we know well. But it's the subversion, how that in parallel another story is told. And maybe if we could talk to us a little bit about that? Yes, it's quite interesting for us to consider this, because based on this analysis, we can better understand Maria Firmina dos Reis as an author who was aware of what she was doing, an author that made choices in terms of how to proceed and how to think about images and topics. And where did that come from? It wasn't from an idea of exceptions, as if Maria Firmina dos Reis herself was an isolated woman inside the state of Maranhão, and she had this brilliant enlightenment, and she would therefore bring to light this person. But no, Maria Firmina dos Reis was a woman that was very aware of her time and moment. So if we think about the narrative that she prepares in terms of giving a greater protagonism to secondary characters, can you see the genius of that? We can think about the parameter of Cabana do Pai Tomás, which was circulating in Maranhão, and Uncle Tom's cabin, and this became a parameter for all those who were writing and dealing with the topic of enslavement. Maria Firmina dos Reis probably read this work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she might have chosen certain elements from that work, not only this work, but also with an open dialogue with Gonçalves Dias, who was a contemporary author. And we can see all these elements clearly in her work. And once she makes these choices, she decided to write her own novel and to imagine the future and to question the present. She imagined a novel, a romance, considering that she was writing for a enlightened elite, so to speak, mostly men than women, because women had, women had a greater difficulty to become literate. So she built her novel or her romance based on a love triangle, which is a topic that is very common in novels. And based on this love story, she starts working with all the different conflicts in her work. Women, she talks about the mother of Ursula's mother. She talks about I can't remember the name of the character, but the women in her novel are become sort of a center with regards to their relationship with the patriarchy, and the other part or group are the enslaved, and they have certain conflicts that become more important than others. So in this construction, in this dynamic, she's able to discuss and urge people to think about it and to allow her readers to engage in this work. And she's really, that's a work of genius.
Lilia, it's known, but these things that we hear have a life of their own. Maria Firmina, when she published her book, she announced her book as one from a Maranhense, a Maranhão writer. What does that mean to say a writer from Maranhão? She didn't use her own name. She wrote under a apocryphal writer. I said that our historiography is very male, very Eurocentric, but it's very southeastern. Everything happens in Rio and São Paulo. There's no problem, no clash or break. In Maranhão, we know that not only São Luís de Maranhão was one of the greatest black cities of the 19th century. We had Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Pelotas, many black cities. São Luís de Maranhão was one of the largest black cities. It was a city with a lot of lettered individuals. In the Viana outbreak broke out, the first name Daniel, we only know the year that he died. Daniel, the leader of this revolt in Maranhão, the enslaved met because there was some of them who read newspapers. They had read about the Paraguay War, they'd read about the war in the United States. They knew that they had released their slaves, and they demanded, therefore, that this enslaved be freed. It was a huge revolt. It was crushed, but there was a led, and they met to read newspapers, and the newspapers were revolutionaries. So people know that in São Luís de Maranhão there was an African Atlantic abolitionist movement that was circulating. This idea of saying that she was from Maranhão has to do with her position as she saw herself. She does autobiographies. There are short excerpts about her, but it has to do with the collective thinking of the time in Maranhão. It's amazing and awesome, the construction of a language and a vocabulary in São Luís de Maranhão, contrary to against slavery, and it's amazing how Maria Firmina, I'm certain that she's certain of issues that are being discussed now. In the book Part of Whiteness, she talks about the narcissistic pact amongst the whites in this place of, the comfortable place of white people, and a black person highlights the theme that the topic that slavery, of course, was very bad for the enslaved, but it was very bad for whites as well, because what it means, having been a slaveholder, and Maria Firmina and Ursula, also in her indigenous novel, it's a beautiful term. We can also talk about this if we have time. She tells about she thematizes the patriarchy, the strength of patriarchy, and the rigor of slavery and patriarchy. And Maria Firmina, Luciana also mentioned this. She gives women an essential place. What is their place in the book? The women, I apologize to the men, have the power to solve conflicts. And if we take the novel, you can, okay, we can feel free to applaud. Don't be shy. She does this with great skill. She locates these social places very with clairvoyance. And Uncle Tom's Cabin reached Brazil in 1858. It was a book which did not circulate much because the slaveholders wanted to ban Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it circulated nevertheless. Perhaps you read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Luisa Floresta, for example, was another feminist writer who talks about abolition. Of course, what's the originality of Maria Firmina? As our Eduardo Jacis Duarte says, it's that she is the first writer of an African Brazilian literature. Why? African Brazilian writing, because her black characters are extremely important in her novels, and the life of these characters, their subjectivity of these characters, the contradictions, the human contradictions, the human caliber of these characters, they are essential, these novels. So Maria Firmina, in fact, the first African Brazilian author that we know in terms of extremely high quality literature. Extraordinary writer, Maria Firmina dos Reis. On this dimension of construction, something is extremely important as well, is that the prior memory, prior to enslavement, this is an interesting aspect because the character talks about her youth. This is Black Susanna in Africa before she was brought to Brazil in a slave ship. It has a clear understanding and an openness to bring to light the experience, which at the time, at the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, it is a prerogative, a secret of the black enslaved population. And this is extremely important. And it's beautiful also the way that she says that she is nourished and feeds on several different friends, men and women, enslaved men and women. And she says that she feeds on the stories these friends, men and women tell her. So there's a familiarity with the circumstances that may not have exist in Uncle Tom's Cabin. I don't know if Luciana agrees. She says that she says that she's a teacher, a school teacher. Her family wanted her to be taken to the town in Guimarães in a litter. Those litters, the enslaved carried people on their backs. She wouldn't allow being carried on a litter. So we're talking about a person who was extremely conscientious, and she died at 95 people. She unfortunately poor and blind. These are part of the stories from the past, and adding to this issue of the divergences and disagreements with her family in being carried in a litter, and to say no, black people aren't beasts of burden to carry me in a litter. And then another interesting thing, this was when she was going to take over as a school teacher, her family has one of some enslaved people. Her uncle, the uncle of Maria Firmina, purchased an enslaved woman for Firmina's mother. This enslaved woman, I forget her name right now, Rita da Natividade. We should remember, we have to remember the names of these people, the names that were forgotten for so long. She had daughters and sons, and Maria Firmina got a step ahead of her mother at the birth of these children, and she went there and freed, it was called manumission, and that this could only be done by the owner themselves. But Maria Firmina dos Reis, that she could do this for her mother. So she said the way that she was went against the family's own power. She was pre-abolitionist in that sense, totally. And Luciana, we could also recall that her story, the slave woman, has a character, a white character, but it's like an intermediate position. I love this story, the slave woman, and she frees two slaves, and the slaveholder comes and says, "You can't free them," and she says, I can, and there's the pain of loss. If you read the album, it's a diary by Maria Firmina. She says that she was never a mother. She was a mother. She adopted 11 children and a number of other stepchildren, and he talks about loss, death, and loneliness. And these are aspects that we should grant to these characters, of course, not only the heroines, but also the subjectivity and the suffering of racism and exclusion, and the way and how for these people it was difficult to break with the vicious circle of exclusion. Thank you, Lilia. We are, as you can see, the questions are streaming in from the audience. So this is a way to tell us that we're reaching the end of our panel. All good things come to an end. But first, before I turn over, when we move on to a question, since we have just one question for both of you, I'd like to ask you a question to provoke you and tease you a moment to wrap up, to organize and wrap up with your final remarks, answering this question, the following question: what do we need? How can we deal with the invisible to draw a true portrait of this writer who reached us without a face, only by fragments? We don't have an image of her, a photograph or painting, and we need so dearly. I think that to bring names to reconstitute the history of authors, black female authors, the example of Maria Firmina in the 19th century. We have Alta de Souza, who was a poet in Rio Grande do Norte, who published a book which had a preface by Olavo de Bilac, who was a great Brazilian writer, and who fell into oblivion. And we have Luciana de Abreu from Rio Grande do Sul, who was a public speaker, one of the first women, a black woman, represented as white, portrayed as white. What happened with Maria Firmina dos Reis? She was portrayed as white even at some stage. We don't have any picture of her. However, she was portrayed and described as a white woman for many years. It was a historical mistake, and some other mistakes and errors that have circulated on Maria Firmina. So this demonstrates a little bit the Brazilian society, which tends to whiten figures which stand out in some way in places which are viewed by white society, in other words, out of place. Maria Firmina, who was a black teacher, journalist, intellectual, no, she couldn't have been black. She couldn't have been that black. The pictures, the descriptions are whitened. So this is important for us to have these names stand out, and their faces with their colors, with the different variations and their diversities. Thank you, Lilia. You owe us debt. I defined this at the beginning, so you could take advantage and talk a little bit about this new experience with the glasses, right? Okay. I believe, as Luciana, the history of art is an arm of imperialism, as we call our art universal, and that of others as handicrafts. The words are not naive, as Toni Morrison said. The words do not represent violence. They are the violence. So these classifications are permeated with extreme violence. And what amazes me is that we never ask who owns the classification. There are always people from the white canon. And what happens with white people like myself? We racialize others, but we do not racialize ourselves. It's as if we were invisible ourselves. So whiteness creates a situation, a very complicated, comfortable situation, as if you don't see yourself. So I just did a test with children's literature, a book called Dark Glasses, or Colored Glasses. It talks about a nice little white elite upper class boy, but he can't see in color. His name was Alvo. His sister was called Clara. His father was Mr. Neves, Mr. Snow, and his mother was Dona Branca. And even Candid, the waiter, was white. All names referring to white. I'm not going to give it a spoiler, but this is a situation. White is not our enemy. We are white who cannot see beyond whiteness. And the story proceeds. He has a dream where he needs to put glasses on, colored glasses. It's like a mixture of Machado de Assis with other different references. He needs to put glasses on to see in color. But the most beautiful thing at the end, he realizes that he doesn't need the glasses, that this is a crossing, a passage. The way to be anti-racist is a process. It's a passage that we all need to undergo. Democracy is a wonderful system because it's an incomplete system. Completeness is part of the challenge. We build a democracy with exclusion. That's the failure with much social inclusion. The beauty is because rights, we always need to conquer our rights once again and win them. We're all here again together, right? I don't know for how long, but we're here together. And the grand utopia is 2023, to build a country which is more inclusive, more plural, and more democratic. The future is right here in front of us, and you don't need glasses to see it. So I hope it was clear to everyone that Lilia did not skirt the topic, since Maria Firmina, and she knows this, the importance of education, the importance of reading and writing to build what we want. We have a question here from the audience for both of you, which is the following. How to produce the fundamental right to freedom in Brazil of the colonized and the marginalized? How to achieve the fundamental right to freedom in Brazil for the colonized and the marginalized? I think that there's a daily practice of participation, surveillance, authority, and humility for us to expand the meanings of freedom, to live in a world without discrimination, the freedom to be oneself, the freedom to know your ancestors, your history. I believe that to guarantee these conditions, this is essential and crucial for us to expand these spaces of freedom and for emancipation, and to guarantee that people, ever since the 19th century, black people, that they are building this path for their emancipation. I believe that it's a practice and a combination of whites, blacks, brown, indigenous, and this plurality of us to understand each other in this way. I think this is the path that I can imagine for our future. Thank you, Lilia. I think that the concept of freedom is closely connected in Brazil. I'm not going to talk generically, because it's amazing when we say in general, we always talk about the Greeks. Why do you think that we used to be Greeks in the past? We were not just Greeks. So I want to think about the right to memory, the many different memories. The right of memory is not guaranteed in Brazil for everybody. We need to guarantee the right to memory. This panel is about this precisely, and I want to guarantee the right to education. We know for several centuries education was not a right for everyone, and it needs to be a right. Public, high-quality education. There are many different ways of fighting inequality. Country, Brazil is the sixth most unequal country in the world, but it's not in Brazil's DNA. We have to change this, and one of the most powerful triggers for this is education. I only believe in this trigger, not in the others. And it's not, I'm not talking about weapons here. Triggers. Maria Firmina, by no coincidence, Maria Firmina was a teacher. She created a mixed co-ed school, public school in the 19th century by no coincidence. Lima Barreto's mother was a teacher who created a school for children because the black populations always knew that the true freedom would not come from the law, the cold letter of the law. The true freedom would come from education. That's why there are countless cases of people who struggled tooth and nail for literacy. We have to have a pact for democracy, which can only be a pact through equality, which involves our citizen surveillance. Citizenship is a crack for democracy, and each person occupies. Brazil will only be less unequal if we have education, much more citizens-focused education. And this is the path for our freedom. It's the best path. So we're reaching the end, and all good things come to an end. It's important to know that Maria Firmina dos Reis was the first woman writer to launch a novel, the first African-Brazilian novelist in Brazil. Perhaps even more important and urgent is to think of Maria Firmina dos Reis as a kind of flaming stage, light illuminating and fertilizing imagination and thinking, encouraging as a call to action and demands attention. I wish you all to continue here in Flip, continue to accompany Maria Firmina and the other roundtables. We have a reminder here, an announcement, the invitation for everyone to follow the book signing session at the Travessa bookstore. It's a ritual, which is right across the town square, just a few steps away. It's not a question. I'm going to read it. We'll close with this reminder, which was requested here. It's not a question, only to state that São Luís, there's strong mobilization for the memory of Maria Firmina, including a title for honorable professor at the Federal University of Maranhão. So congratulations to the Federal University in Maranhão. Congratulations, everyone. And here we are. Attempting to overcome oblivion. So, good morning. Wonderful flip for everybody. Ótimo. Muito bem. Tá, vou só esticar as pernas.